The prophecies of the Old Testament respecting the Messiah, considered and proved to be literally fulfilled in Jesus, containing an answer to the objections of the author of the scheme of literal prophecy. Preface. The design of the following sheets is to consider the prophecies of the Old Testament respecting the Messiah, and to prove that they are literally fulfilled in Jesus against both Jews and deists. I have therefore collected together the exceptions of the former to those prophecies, and the rather because they are, as far as known, made use of by the latter. I have consulted as much as I am able the writings both of the old and latter Jews, and shown that in most, if not in all prophecies considered, they have understood them of the Messiah. I produce these authorities not as decisive in this controversy, but as the convictions and concessions of an adversary, and that a bitter and implacable one to Christianity, and which I think deserves consideration with the deists. I cite old Jews to show that the sense of ancient synagogue, the latter ones to show the strength of conviction upon their mind, who cannot but have observed what use the Christians have made of these prophecies, and though often pinched with them, yet they have been obliged to own them as prophecies of the Messiah, for which reason the testimonies of latter Jews seem to have the most strength and force in them, and that the reader may not be at a loss about old Jews and latter Jews. He is desired to observe that by old Jews I mean those who wrote or are supposed to have wrote within the first 5 or 6 centuries after Christ, as the authors of the Targums, Talmuds, Rabbath, Zohar, and of latter Jews, I mean those who wrote within the last 5 or 6 centuries, Maimonides, Jarkin, Ben Ezra, Joachim, etc. The author of the scheme of literal prophecy, whose exceptions I have all long considered, has advanced several things with regard to the belief of the Jews concerning a Messiah, which I think myself obliged to take notice of in this place. Secondly, the same authors intimates that many of the Jews themselves have seemed to have no expectation of a Messiah, as the Sadducees and scribes, and the Samaritan Jews. Josephus and some of his time are Heliel in the 3rd century. Nay, Maimonides speaks very indifferently of it. As to the Sadducees, they as impatiently expected the Messiah as the rest of the Jews did, whereas intent upon detecting of Jesus, whom they suppose not to be the true Messiah, and were as violent opposed of him and his followers as any others which they would not have concerned themselves about, had they not believed in a Messiah. Some say that the Karaites are of the old stock of the Sadducees, and hold the same doctrines as they did, who it is certain expect a Messiah as much as the other Jews do. As to the scribes, who though they were, as this author says, lettermen, yet believed, Mark 7 verse 35, 9 to 11, that Christ or the Messiah is the son of David, and that Elias must come first. Indeed, he says that what he has said of the Sadducees and scribes he only proposes in the way of conjecture, but it seems to be a conjecture without any foundation for it. As to the Samaritan Jews, nothing is more manifest that in the times of Jesus they expected a Messiah. It was a notion which seemed universally to obtain among them, as appears from the woman of Samaria, with whom Jesus conversed, who could say, John 4:25, I know that Messiah cometh, which is called Christ. It is allowed that the modern ones have notions of a Messiah, though very confused and very different, which need not be wondered at, since they reject the books of the prophets and confine themselves to the 5 books of Moses. In one of their letters to Seliger, they say the name of Messiah with them is, which it seems they could not know the signification of, though it seems to be an abbreviation of he that is to come, whereby the Samaritans, well as the Jerusalem Jews, understood the Messiah, as is manifest from the words of the woman just now mentioned. As to Josephus and some other Jews in his time, who, thought that Vespasian was the prince that was to come. It is manifest enough that they expected a Messiah, though they were mistaken in the person whom they thought to be, nor could anything else be fairly concluded from hence. Hillel, it is true, gave out that Israel was to have no Messiah, because they enjoined him in the days of Hezekiah. But then, this was only the opinion of a single person, for notwithstanding his authority, the Jews still expect a Messiah. Besides this saying of his was not a disbelief of the Messiah, but a mistaken notion about the time of his coming. And as for Maimonides, speaking indifferently of Messiah, it need not be wondered at in him, nor in any other of his notions, if there has been any other who has done so, since they have been so wretchedly disappointed in their expectation of him, and since they see no little need of and expect so little from him. Thirdly, this same author would have us believe that the expectation of a Messiah among the Jews was grounded not upon the literal, but upon an allegorical and traditional sense of the Scriptures. But if so, how come the scribes who, as this author acknowledges, were a party of lettermen who expect a Messiah, and to say that he was the son of David, as has been before observed? Surely these men, who are supposed to have rejected many of the prevailing Jewish notions not founded in the letter of the Scriptures, would have rejected the notion of a Messiah if not found therein. Besides, the Karatites and the Scriptorians, an ancient sect among the Jews, rejecting the mystical, enigmatic, traditional and allegorical expositions of the rabbis, strictly and closely adhere to the very letter of the Scriptures, and yet expect a Messiah, as much as other Jews do. Now, from when could this expectation arise, or whereon could it be grounded, but the literal sense of the Scriptures? It is a mistake that a notion of a Messiah cannot be established from the prophecies of the Old Testament without a mystical and allegorical sense of them. For in their first literal and obvious sense they respect him, as I hope the following account of them will make appear. Fourthly, it cannot be much wonder that this author should think most probable that many of the places wherein the Messiah is expressly named in the Chaldee paraphrase are interpolations, especially when he thinks that those writings are much more modern and of a later date than the Jews would have them to be. For the later the date of them is, the less reason is for to suppose them to be interpolated in these passages with respect to the Messiah. For surely it can never be thought that they would take such a method with their own targums on those prophecies, when they must suppose to know what use the Christians made of them, both against them and in vindication of Christianity. Nor is there anything with which the Jews are more puzzled and confounded than when they are urged with the paraphrases, and there is a great deal of reason to suppose that those places wherein the Messiah is expressly named are so far from being interpolations that were not these writings so sacred with them as that they dare not corrupt them, they would have expunged them long ago. As to the author's reasons for these thoughts, that what Josephus says, those Jews who were in the vulgar error of the belief of Messiah to arise out of their nation built their expectation on one ambiguous oracle of prophecy found in their sacred books. I would only reply that Josephus indeed speaks of an oracle or prophecy founded in their sacred books, that about that time one of them from their country should rule over the world, which oracle he calls an ambiguous one, and says was what chiefly excited the Jews to the war. But then he nowhere says that the Jews' expectation of Messiah was built upon one single doubtful prophecy, but that their expectation of his arising out of their country, and at that time was so, the ambiguity of which oracle lay in his arising out of their nation, which some understood of his being born there, as the generality of the Jews did and others, of his entering upon his government there, as Josephus did, and therefore applied it to Vespasian. from whence it appears that this incident gives no reason to conclude that the passages respecting the Messiah in the Chaldee paraphrases are interpolations, for the Jews might have many plain prophecies on which they built their expectation of a Messiah, some of which these paraphrases have pointed out to us. And yet Josephus speaks but of one ambiguous and doubtful prophecy respecting the time of his coming and the country from whence he was to arise, which excited the Jews to war and animated them obstinately to persist therein, in which he supposes them to be mistaken, though, alas, the ground of their mistake, and which therefore was fatal to them, was that the Messiah, the person prophesied of, was already come. I conclude with desiring the reader to observe that I do not produce the prophecies of the Old Testament respecting the Messiah's second coming as literal fulfilled in Jesus, but as to be so fulfilled in him, and the reason for my taking notice of them is to make the scheme of prophecy more complete, and seeing all the rest of the prophecies respecting Messiah have had literal completion in Jesus, this is a great deal of reason to believe that these will also, especially seeing it is such a compilation in him that Jesus and his apostles have given us reason to expect. I have not indeed inquired into the authenticity of the book of Daniel and of the 2 first chapters of St. Matthew's Gospel, which the author of the scheme of literal prophecy has called into question, but have taken them from genuine parts of the sacred writings. The reason why I have not attempted an inquiry of this nature when I have had occasion to consider some passages in these parts of Scripture is because I was not willing to interrupt the reader by breaking the thread of prophecy. I must confess that what this author has advanced on this head deserves consideration, and I hope that some of the learned writers in this controversy will think it worth their notice and regard. I shall only add that whereas my design in writing the following sheets is an honest and impartial inquiry after truth and an attempt to establish and promote it, in doing of which, as I have treated the arguments with candour and temper, so I hope, if I shall appear to be mistaken in anything I have advanced, I shall be candidly treated, as I shall be heartily thankful for such a discovery.